of 100 favourite Gaelic poems. And also joining us tonight are two poets whose work is also included in the 100 selection. Inez McKinnon and Deborah Moffat. And we're all spread all over Scotland. Joe's up in Skye, Peter in Edinburgh, Deborah in Fife, agus Inez as na Críochan in the border. So, cymmer a haas we willen nog.
Jo haast.
Jo haast, magaridu. Well, the Huilen Fancy Hujoch Gaberbiko Hakodrin is an Eastoch. A very warm welcome to all the audience members tonight. And I think we've got quite a full house, which is really, really encouraging. And we really do appreciate that so many of you take the time to join us on these Zoom events, because there's so many of them around just now, and you could go to umpteen things. So thank you for being with us tonight. Like I said, it's going to be a bilingual event. It'll be a mix of chat and poetry. But we also want to hear from you, our listeners. So if you have any questions or comments you would like to put to the panel tonight, please do so. I see we've got over 40 people altogether. So you can let me know via the chat or via Q&A, and I'll keep my eye on that. And as we're going through the night, I'll put your points to everybody involved. So, han y milchen dy goran agus dy fardoch gagin as y Gaelic. So, han y rhywun nach chi dolan uaf besoch dwlich agus môr am dy fadig agus dy Jo ha yn tyrg y fasio I gianu. But both Peter and Jo have previous on this, so to speak. They've both edited Gaelic poetry anthologies before, so they knew what they were taking on with this proposal from Bua. Peter was co-editor with Ian S. Macpherson of Your Lia, the Light Blue book, a book of transgressive and love poetry, which appeared, I think, in 2006 or thereabouts. Jo has edited Cainachan, Remembrance, which was a collection of First World War poetry, the first Gaelic collection ever, and that was published by Achgeth. So, hatar yolish egin G shake, is cloinishin marachashu chimical ever nobushin nisaja third, achashin de la horsach let down, and I want to kick off with a poem, and it's a poem about song. It's the second poem in the book, and I'd like to invite Jo to tell us about this poem. And I know she was very well acquainted with the author, the poet himself. So over to you, Jo.
Thank you very much, Catriona. I'll tell you a little bit about the author first. Paul McKinnon, he was born in Gurok, but his father died when he was quite young, so he was brought up in his grandparents' house in Grimsay in North Uist. He became a school teacher, a primary school teacher, and interestingly, when I left a job I had with BBC Schools Department in Edinburgh a very, very long time ago, Paul was appointed producer in my place, and he worked there making some fantastic programmes for kids until a very untimely death. When he was just 59. He's probably better known as a dramatist and a short story writer. There's a posthumous collection of his work called Ngu Eivnoch. It was published, I think, in 1993. But I'm very fond of this poem of his, and I would really like to thank someone who brought it to my attention again. I had forgotten when we were working on this book. It's called Hiadoran. I'm going to read it in Gaelic first, and then I'll read it in English. So, Hiadoran le Paul McKinnon. Der chrinich at nua vachi, sa chasgad sgiw ganich na con. Rhain ches in hanne trogydd edrych crafen roge sy'n crioch yn gialdoch. Hanig misnioch gyn gleitiad o chwmart so fehich yn alwy na heiche. Hanig bwyochus mewn vlas, men was sjellegge y chaelo. Han ik wasig nad sŵl, sva cymig ŵr yn Gymraeg. Agus chwalus, gysochgydd, ffroi, y chynasgorn an ferrigen, na tjeiden djújod, y chyd ŵliad na stalichen. Mar jod eifnoch na talafin, a snien y creg, y neichod, y rwgyd yn hjol. agus as a viola in English, it's the first song by Paul McKinnon. When they gathered in the damp cave and hushed the whimpering of the dogs, the heat of the fire blessed the frozen bones and fearful hearts. They grew confident they were safe from danger and the wild animals of night. They gave thanks for the warmth, for a successful day's hunt. A spark came to their eyes, and there was a new shape to their conversation. And they heard, gentle, gravelly, rising from someone's throat, timid notes that made even the ledges listen. As if the earth had tears of joy, the rocks wept that night that music was born.
That's lovely, Jo. I have to say I wasn't familiar with this poem at all. And whoever brought it to your attention and to our attention, thank you for doing that, because it's really lovely. And it really, I suppose, it's the second poem in the collection. The first one's about Gaelic, but the two of them together, they set the scene for the rest of the book really, really eloquently, I think. So thank you for that reading. Jo and Peter, I was going to say, this book, it's come together quite quickly. It's the product of lockdown, I understand, really, because I can remember hearing about this project. It seems not that long ago. And suddenly here we are with the published book. So can you tell me how the whole process came about? Peter?
Well, it's, to be honest, with the lockdown, I'm not sure we'd ever finished it, or certainly in the time that we had been stuck with the help of Jo's fantastic library behind her was a huge boon for us. If we'd been reliant on the books I have here, it would have been a lot more difficult, certainly. But we started about January, February this year in seriousness, looking for public suggestions for the poems, getting a panel of experts together, and then gathering the text ourselves. So it is within about 10, 11 months. I hope it doesn't look like a rush job. It did feel that sometimes as if there was an awful lot of work had to be done at different points, especially because so many of the poems had to be re-edited and translated.
I didn't mean to imply that at all, Fandrik.
Oh, I can still see the scars in some of the places where I might want to polish over. But I think it was, certainly we could dedicate a lot more time to it than we might otherwise have. It's one of the oddities of the last 8 months in everybody's lives. Time has worked differently.
To your advantage in some ways then, you know, in terms of the being able to concentrate on it to a degree. You mentioned a panel there as well. Can you, who was your panel of experts?
If I can answer that. Ian MacDonald, who was formerly editor of the Gaelic Books Council, a great enthusiast and a poet himself. Don William Motherstan, who is in charge of Storland, very knowledgeable about Bardach. I remember hearing him in Ness, we both come from Ness, reciting and singing poems when I was very young. He's even younger than I am. And
my age, Jo, we were in school together.
Okay. Ellie Cormick, who is one of the Cormacks of Portree, one of the singers in Sheehan, and again did her degree in Glasgow University and is very fond of poetry as well. And who have I left out? The Morag-Ann McNeill. I wouldn't dare leave her out. I wouldn't want to leave her out. Morag-Ann is a poet. She's a writer, well known for her very recent translation of Anne of Green Gables. So these were the panel. We submitted various lists that we drew up and asked them for their opinion. They sifted, we debated, but I suppose at the end of the day it came down to Peter and I to make final decisions.
And you did ask the public to submit suggestions as well. Did you get a huge response from the public?
Yeah, we got hundreds of nominations, and many of the poems were ones that we wouldn't have thought of, poems that we didn't know, or poems that that had been sitting in drawers and had never seen the light of day before, but also some of the old classics that it was good to be reminded of, good to be made to read again and go, actually, how does this stand up as a poem? How does this stand up as a song? And many of the pieces in the book found their way in there through that process. It was somebody making the case, going, this means a lot to me. And we went, we can see why. And this is an important or fun piece that we would like to have in.
So it may have been a piece that wasn't particularly well known amongst the general public, but whoever recommended it was so passionate about it, you felt that could be shared amongst everybody.
This is just one selection of favourites. And so I think there are lots of, we were never going to go for the full public vote for fear that somebody would take it over and it would just be Halig all the way. Or if I voted for myself 3,000 times, I'd be at the top. These kind of things. I think it was much better to be talking about what individuals felt meant a lot to them rather than to do it in terms of pure numbers.
Indeed. And did you feel a pressure to include many living poets?
I wouldn't say there was pressure to include, I mean, I think the pressure was in making the selection. There are many poets, there are many poems and songs that we would have loved to have included, but at the end of the day, 100 is 100. And when you're dealing with such a rich corpus of material as we have in Gaelic, well, hard decisions had to be made.
I can imagine it couldn't have been easy, Jo. And that corpus includes a rich tradition of songs that have come down over many centuries, but also contemporary songs. And Inush, you must be absolutely delighted that one of your songs made the cut. Bereshloch, a song that is well loved and has travelled far and wide across the world through the wonderful singing of Karen Matheson and Capercaillie.
I like to tell people, I can't sing a note, but I've got one of the best voices in Scotland. Her name is Karen Matheson.
Indeed, you do.
It's a great privilege to hear the song sung by Karen, and I believe others have been. I've seen reference to it as a contemporary classic, which moves me greatly.
Mm-hmm. It's a beautiful song, Inush. For those who may not be so familiar with it, do you want to give us a wee bit of context, why the song was written?
Honestly, can't really say now. It's a wee while back. I think it was I'm a poet in the modern idiom, essentially, but I found myself thinking at one stage, I'm writing more in English than in Gaelic, but I found myself thinking Gaelic poetry is to a large extent song. The song is very strong. And I thought, could I write a poem in song form? And Breishlach was the result. And several years after that, I was working with Uncommon Gaelic in Argyll. And this young lad, who I think was still at school, but they played in a wee band called the Edib Folk that became Capercaillie. Donald Shaw asked me, do you have any songs I could have a look at, Angus? And I said, well, have a look at this one. And to my great honour and delight, it became the title track of their next album, Delirium, which is the English translation of Breishlach. And don't ask me why I thought of Breishlach as a theme. I've had a few delirious moments in my life. So maybe that was it.
Well, how about we hear the song then, in Gaelic first of all, and then you can read it in English for us, please.
Breishlach. Chaim Yegan chuile chaltin hiru chrán san bio. Ach sé vir chuile géach dudense gymrhiel. Chaim Yeg trai börich, launje chuile gan a bhuin. Noch go chuile snig njaunit, dalikse aloi. Chaim steig an neun tajoste sant skjurse gas McKinnon. Chuile glanje hook me, do vashach ast na jaun. Fluin mit tra hareir gan neppi, us roke gas ni suin. Ach a duke kit go cattle, cos an gianin doen. Jiren se vi sur at haarjug ach a vilsin reintje keel, de chummu bi an art de haule, ach an vies an jeel. Gak am in an vuhir gorach, borug hargen lit a chlu, nur a hiku, chiad nach il merach an am ju. Chiet sgwrdd daes le sylfrw, faffus uller as y rhain, staff gycwf a gantrum sŵler, mirwch mwyn sŵl. Chiet misys dus y sŵgrwch, bil ribil ar nanel ywnd, criet a hwm a sioc gwsir, y cheile fer mwyn. You want the English version?
Yes, please.
Delirium. And I suppose I was tapping into what was essentially familiar to me, what was around me. The hazelwood. I used to go gathering nuts when I was a young child, really, in the season. Sorry. Delirium. I went to the hazelwood yesterday, seeking hazelnuts for food, but on every branch and twig was your pursuing face. I went to the fertile shore yesterday to gather cockles for a meal. Every single shell was filled with your beauty, my love. I went into the alehouse to expel you from my head. Every glass I raised, your beauty overflowed from it. I went early to bed last night to escape you in sleep, but you kept me awake till I'd make you a song. I'd wish we were torn asunder were we not apart. Let your presence replace my image of you and how I'd rejoice. You brought me to foolish babbling, tiring friends with praise of you. When you return, they'll see that my words are true. They'll see mountains dance with ripples, mold and eagle, step the reel, red rasp held by kind sea tangle, sport before their eyes. They'll see you and me make merry, lip to lip, our breath as one, caressing thus forever, together our reward. I have actually made several 1 or 2 line attempts at doing a singable English version of that, but I just, if anybody wants to have a go, I'm going to be very happy to hear it.
Well, that brings us very nicely on to translation, Anush, because I know you translate your own works. Some poets don't translate their own, they get other poets to translate them for them. There's a lot of debate about translation, but maybe Deborah, for instance, might be interested in taking on that challenge of a translation of Breslach to be sung.
I'll have a go. I'll try it.
We can maybe discuss that later on, but that would be great. But the whole debate about translation, I know, Deborah, in your sole Gaelic collection to date, I know you write in both English and in Gaelic, and you've had 2 English collections and a Gaelic one. You do not provide English translations of your poetry. I presume that's quite a definite move on your part, and that you don't want to be.
I don't want to translate them myself, partly because I write in English. What I would want to write in English wouldn't be the same thing that I had written in Gaelic, and I would always feel, well, actually haven't got that right, and then I would want to basically start over with a whole different poem in English, and so it just doesn't really work for me, and I just feel that it would be like it wouldn't look as a wouldn't necessarily make a good English poem, which doesn't mean it's a bad Gaelic poem. It's just that they're completely different things for me anyway. And in fact, I didn't even think I could translate anybody else, and still I started translating Niall's poems, and he helped me find my way into doing that. I don't think I could have done it without, with an author that wasn't alive and that I didn't know, that I wasn't comfortable with making the changes for. But
well, they've been very successful translations.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
I know there are a lot of Gaelic writers who feel very uncomfortable about the translation process, but for me, I started writing in English. Gaelic was almost an afterthought. It was really only when in my mid-20s I went to university and decided, Gaelic was the only language I had access to. And it was while I was at Glasgow University with Donald John MacLeod as assistant editor of Girim, the Gaelic magazine, the Gaelic Quarterly. Donald John got me writing poetry in Gaelic. And every quarter he'd say, do you have anything new to have a look at? And essentially that's where it all started. But mainly I was a poet in English.
How about you, Patrick? I don't think you're keen on translating your own work, are you?
I'm fine with it. I don't mind at all. I think there's a difference when I'm translating my own work and other people's. When I translate my own, I'm deeply dishonest. I just mess around as much as I want. And in some ways, anybody who can speak Gaelic gets the added bonus of trying to work out what the relationship between the two texts is, basically, what the relationship is. When I'm translating other people, I tend, and I'm getting more conservative. I'm getting more faithful as I get older. And so when I was working with Ian Macpherson in Your Leah, we took quite a few liberties. We would change lines around. Keeping a musicality was at times more important than the literal sense. But in this book, I think it was important that there was, you could follow the meaning and have some musicality as well as you were going through the translations.
Yes, I feel that, if I could say, with your own work at times, it's definitely not a literal translation in English of your Gaelic poem. It's a very different poem, a very strong standalone English poem. So you're almost creating two separate poems.
I would tend to think so. And I would sometimes, to be honest, I write between the languages. I'll do a draft in one, a draft in the other, and they'll inform each other. And sometimes when I translate other people, I do something similar. And so the translation of Niall's poem that is in the book, Behu Ur, I take a lot of liberties, but I could ask him. I could say, is this okay? And I got permission, and that made me feel legitimized.
Yeah.
Whether I would do the same with Ulster, MacFaithir Ulster, maybe, but it would have to be good.
Indeed, because it's almost becoming the norm now for many poetry collections, but certainly for, well, anthologies like this, that they are bilingual. Publishers seem to like it. It certainly reaches a greater audience, but Joe and I and Denise are old enough to remember that the more traditional bardic poetry we weren't familiar with in English at all. Growing up. So it's kind of almost like it's the newer Bardock that has tended towards the translation rather than the older material.
When they were published with translations, the translations almost invariably were prose translations, and they didn't really convey a terrible sense of the excitement you and I had access to in reading the original. There was a plodding quality to the translations very often. I think you would.
Yeah. Would you agree that things are often lost in translation?
Are you asking me?
Well, anybody.
Patrick, data werk.
Things are changed in translation, certainly. You're going to lose the musicality. You might pick up different differences. It's like a process. It's either going through a washing machine or going through a dirt machine. It picks up grit or it gets cleaned out, but it's not quite the same thing on the other side. With luck, it's got its own dynamic, its own strength, its own rhythms, its own life, but it's not the same thing.
Deborah, I think this would be a good time to hear one of your poems. So this, I think we're going to hear Eva, which was published in Nandul just last year.
Yes.
So congratulations to you too on getting into Catriona Murray.
Thank you. Yeah, I was really surprised and really pleased. But,
for those who may not be so familiar with your work, Deborah, just should tell people you're originally from the USA, from Vermont, but you've been living in Scotland for almost 40 years or so.
Yeah, getting there. Yeah.
And you're a Gaelic learner.
Yeah, I started in about
43.
Yeah, exactly. I came as a child, not. But I've I started learning Gaelic about 15 years ago, no, 10 years ago. Can't remember anymore, but relatively new anyway. I didn't start writing in Gaelic until I had learned it a lot. I never thought I could even begin to, that I wouldn't have the vocabulary, and the vocabulary is actually not the kind of stara. The real problem is the idiom, making sure you're idiomatic without falling into cliche is the problem I have, because you always want to break new boundaries with poetry. But anyway, so I shall read Eva for you.
Can I just say, one of the guests has asked us to give the poem number so they can follow it in the book.
Oh, right, sorry. Now, good for you. Thanks for that, Patrick. I'd completely forgotten about that. Well, this is poem 10, actually. Yes, poem 10.
Okay, Eva. A jawn sinúla ha mi has down an Eden, is mir mo glunchen a glana gagare. A spinag nan droyen is nan cluren, a salachag mo laven green gala, is an ur horech. Shalachagan sliam a slevnahagar harantalu, boichikin loopersech, a sneev mu movior, schenken a ruith nam breslach, dulakin a duskagas and suain leshk. Kulikin a shelin a shranja, mo chimichal mo chluasan. Bruyere gladarna goijn am boichikin beg asantalu, is rabit riabar santach a kriamag nan lusen ura. Klachaken falekte ans an ur a brishig moinien, is skelepen burach gloinia lotag molaven, moula kruvagasta. Smisha a surachag anam falas mulgnush, a chilega jonsen na talavain, asen tugag me. Ne mahulien foskeltje is fiesrach ma is olk. Hami has dan an Eden, a jawan shinula. Okay. In the translation, which I think Peter did on his own, I'm not sure. Eve. In spite of all that, I am still in Eden, on my knees, cleaning the garden, tearing up the thorns and thistles, dirtying my elegant white hands with the black fertile soil. Sleek slugs sliding across the ground, contorting worms winding round my fingers, diligent ants rushing headlong, beetles waking out of their lazy sleep, flies and bees humming around my ears, a bold robin stealing small worms from the ground, and the fat, greedy rabbit nibbling on new plants, pebbles hidden in the soil breaking my nails, and sharp shards of glass piercing my hands, my blood gushing out of them, and me laboring through the sweat of my brow, working back towards the ground I grew out of, with my eyes open, knowing about good and evil. I am still in Eden, in spite of all that.
That's wonderful, Deborah, and one I think that many of us can agree with, certainly. I've really enjoyed looking through these 100 poems, and I think what I've enjoyed most is the mix of the well-known and, like I was saying about the one that Joe chose earlier, the ones I wasn't so familiar with. And I think that is what people will enjoy from it. So you have Alice na Glana Gaelic by Siris na Cepi, one of the best known songs in the canon of Gaelic literature, frequently sung, alongside a song that I wasn't familiar with at all, but another song in praise of an Alistair, or an the McCullough, by Jirrel Nich Gebruin, Dorothy Brown, and I'd never heard of Dorothy Brown. She was from Argyll. So it's a nice mix of the well-known and the lesser-known. Patrick, I think you're going to give us a couple of verses from both of these.
I'm going to give a snippet from both of these.
Of how these women are praising their men. I
think sometimes we're slightly shy about the fact we've got fantastic praise poems in Gaelic, poems that discuss the qualities of men or women. And they almost became a cliche in the 20th century, the clan and chief poetry. We've got far too much of them. But some of it is beautiful, beautiful work. And it gives you a sense of different value systems, different codes, different ethoses, as well as just having this fantastic sound quality. And so I'm going to read just a tiny little bit of both of them, starting with what is poem 15 in the book, Alstar Glen Garich by Siris na Cepi. And I'm going to read the sixth stanza, the sixth and the seventh. Between loch nach feitje hemich, betu topper fel in the slantje, betu by nevish hagach enoch, betu chruk nach feitje harnich, betu clach fully gechastel, betu wach lech in the straatje, betu leeg over nam bohen, betu clach oorshel amanje. between Chur, Harkach Collie, between Daroch Dangin Yager, between Covain, between Dryan, between Tull Moloch Blavor, Haro Mir Anna Den Krian, Harotach Lear I Fjarne, Harotach Hard is Ridewin, Tulianan and Bamalvin. And it's so difficult to translate this and to keep that musicality, to keep those repetitions. You were the loch that couldn't be emptied, the generous well of health, Ben Nevis above other mountains, the cliff that couldn't be scaled. You were the capstone on the castle, the broad flagstone of the street, the precious jewel of goodness, the proud stone of my ring. You were the yew above each wood, you were the strong, steadfast oak, you were the holly, you were the blackthorn, the rough-barked flowering apple. You hadn't a single twig of aspen, you were not the alder's dew. You had no friendship with the lime tree. You were the darling of fine women. Now, did we include this just so that I had the challenge of translating one of the most famous Gaelic songs ever and doing it justice, with Joe keeping me very, very right as I went very, very far wrong? Maybe.
Well, I think you have done it justice. It's a very well-known song. And I was just pointing out to the panelists, it's number 15 in the book, in case you wanted to follow it. And the one he's going to read just now is number 14, I think.
It is. I'm going to do just the very end of it, so over the page. And this is for, as you said, another Alistair. This is Alistair MacCulloch Gasta, one of the great heroes of Gaelic sword swinging. Struach nachil mi mar bachleim, cawn fi cadan an a machlish. Calan lia yn jay a chasgyrst, sy'n crwner yn jay a galachgych. Bydd hwntoch a goen cattle, gyda bi chracrwy malapi. It's a shame I'm not as I'd wish, with Macallan's head in my armpit, Grey Colin having been butchered and the crowner having been captured, how cheerfully I'd sleep then, though my bed was a hard rock face.
Thank you, Patrick.
One of the things that's utterly astonishing about the poetry of that time is how they created wonderful poetry out of utter savagery. Butchery and slaughter, yes. And yet it's wonderful, wonderful poetry.
And especially the woman in it, you know, they tell it like it is, and they're not afraid to go there.
Quite often we'd have these conversations. Can we include this bit of this poem or another bit? And I'd be going, but this is the bit with the guts, or this is the bit with the rat attacking, or this is the bit with decomposition. We have to include that.
I began to get very worried about Peter at one stage in this book. Every second poem seemed to have blood, guts, gore, and so on. But then we turned a corner, and
you had to rein him in now and again. I'm seeing we have a query here. Is there any chance in future, perhaps, of an accompanying CD or set of music files to be produced in order to allow readers to hear the poetry spoken? If there was a second edition, perhaps, or that would be a lot of music.
Fantastic idea.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Perhaps one for Corneliorican to think about.
Well, indeed. Perhaps.
I was going to say we'll have to speak to our funders, I think, is the main thing.
Okay. Indeed. I wanted to talk about the songs and poems in the collection that appear anonymously, as we say in Gaelic, Gunure, another author, Gunure. You've got 14 examples of these all together, and many of them are very well known. Again, songs Ian Glynchuach, Con Grigor Fógrach, Bohanari, Ranoch, many like that. And many of them love songs as well, which could be open to interpretation, you know, whether they were written for, not so much for men or women, but who actually composed them. I
think we could have chosen 100 poems Gunure as our favourites. And I think we've got some issues in Gaelic with how we look back at our history and how we understand it. I think In some ways, it appears a conservative culture from the outside, and it may have been. But I think there were so many things that weren't said or weren't spoken in the culture that quite a lot of it is coded. So it was important, say, to us that we have LGBTQ poets in the anthology as it was. But it's also, and this is something myself and Ian tried to do in the Lord as well, to look back at the older songs and go, okay, not just who might have composed this, but who might have sung it, and how might it have been sung. And I think one of the important things is there's this wonderful ambiguity with many of our anonymous poems that depending on who you imagine singing it, then you have an entirely different context. One of my favorite songs, which isn't in here, and I'm quite annoyed, if only I could have changed it, is Alsteria Og Viknyakol, about imagining, dreaming of having been able to give Alsteria 5 or 6 or 7 children. And if you imagine that as being sung by a man rather than a woman, then it's got this very, very different dynamic of the relationship.
Indeed. On that point, last week at our event, I had a question in from Marcus McKinnon that we weren't able to include because we didn't see it was on Facebook, so we weren't able to include it. So I did promise to raise it tonight. And he was asking, in Mckinnon bard LGBTC hacking a silk bard ac na Gaelic and you vel ha bard Gaelic as a lor.
Ha.
Ha. So
So I'll switch back to English. Christopher Whitesay has written very, very eloquently and strongly about his own life and about his own experiences and difficulties that gay men in Scotland have faced throughout the 70s and 80s. And it's scandalous that it was so late that the law in Scotland got changed only in 1980. And so we've got Christopher in there. We've also got some figures who, and again, it's hard to say because of the nature of the coding and because of the circumstances that they were writing in. And yet, if I was teaching them in a class, I'd be encouraging people to read them, to looking for the various signs.
Indeed, there may be many or a number of bards in there who weren't out in that sense and found it difficult to talk about. So we won't know that, but you can read what you will from the poetry. I'm going to change the topic slightly. In terms of the Gunura, I did come across one which I was very pleased to find, and it's a children's verse. And it was quite emotional for me to find it. And it was in cat, agus a luchach san cat, hwt a luchach as an tawl, kit e dawn, a chet schrein gwash, card is common agus gulf, hwt a dus a hinemach. And the reason for that was, it's all about, for those who don't speak Gaelic, about a cat trying to entice a mouse out of the hole, of course, in order to pounce on the mouse. But the mouse is quite canny and refuses to come out. But it's one of those poems that as children in primary school, many moons ago, we used to read, and a cousin of mine won the first prize at the Mord singing that, reciting that poem. And I haven't heard it in over 40, 50 years. So it was really, really sweet to stumble across that. And I think that's the joy of a collection like this. That's why I suppose we don't want to share everything that's in the book, because you want people to find these gems that are gems for them personally, hidden within its pages. I think we'll hear another poem now, though. I'm going to ask you to read a very well-known, again, Gunura, anonymous poem, but a very well-known one in Gaelic, Uavanor.
The wonderful thing about the book is so many pages, you turn so many pages and you find these gems, some of which you will be familiar with, others you're not. I mean, Uavanor is a very well-known song, and I do wish I could sing it. But there's something wonderfully primitive, is not the word, but essential about songs like Uavanor. Is truagari country lawn, dar lime sa feeb, is truagari country lawn. da laim sa fib, slam sa chlayw. Itter in y chrwch, y chrwch, y chrwch. Itter in y chrwch, ma chwydach yr mager. Itter in y lwy, y lwy, y lwy. Itter in y lwy, si galwan y harich mi. Ma hwf ffôms mioled brohw, dŵl am hŵl, dŵl am hŵl. Da fyr erin gyrsir sierw, an am glwn, an am glwn. Byn y min fica na'n gwr chrygach, ma'n tîl misio, o mwaf yn oer. Sna lohan cliata na'n eich gielte, ma'n tîl misio, mwaf yn oer. Byn y lwy fica na'n craw edrin, ma'n tîl misio, mwaf yn oer. Sna mich gwchgwn yn ffyr echga, mas tîl misio, mwaf yn oer. Siefig meidyn og for hiet var, het je nu. Man tîl misio, mwaf yn oer. It's a wonderful understatement in many ways, in that particular, the second line in the last quatrain, het je nu, will go over, will have died. You know, you read it literally, you just think, go over where? But it's about death. The cave of gold. And yes, it's Ganura. And it's a shame, O Lord, I didn't have 3 hands, 2 hands on the pipes, 2 hands on the pipes. It's a shame, O Lord, I didn't have 3 hands, 2 hands on the pipes, 1 hand on my sword. Between us is the harp, the harp, the harp. Between us is the harp, my friends have left me. Between us is the harp, the harp, the harp. Between us, my love, is the green bitch who wronged me. Lying on my side, my flesh is rotting, a beetle in my eye, 2 iron barbs repeatedly thrusting into my knee. The wee kids will be rock climbing goats before I return from the cave of gold, and harrowing colts be saddled horses before I return from the cave of gold. Little calves will be milking cows before I return from the cave of gold. And suckling sons be men of war before I return from the cave of gold. Many young girls in their first bridal veil will have passed over before I return from the cave of gold. The other wee kind of mysterious phrase, description, the green bitch, I presume she's from Gaelic folklore or something, but I don't know any other reference to the green bitch, but she stands out. Does anybody else have anything to say about the green bitch?
At some point, I talked about this as a very Freudian poem, with all of these caves and swords and pipes, and perhaps a fear of female sexuality, but that might just be making things up.
Very good. I've just noticed we have a couple of questions here, so I'm just going to ask them. The first one is from Christina Mackenzie. It's in Gaelic. Rodana on the Bacorder of Gamor Bagavriagalas. Was there a poem that you really, really love that you had to leave out? This is for Joe and for Peter, obviously. Patrick.
I'll let Joe go first.
The straight answer is yes, and it wasn't just one, it was many. And we hummed and hawed and made lists and refined them and re-refined them, and eventually, as time was running out and we had to start work on the texts and the translations and the biographies, there are biographies of the poets at the end of the book, we just had to draw a line at 100 and say so on. But yes, I suspect were we doing it again next year, the selection might be different. But in the time that we had, and the mood we were in, and the times, I suppose, that's the 100 that we selected.
I think you guys have sorted out a program, an annual program for the rest of your lives. Volume 2 next year.
Well, Anish, my hair is as grey as yours, and it can only now start going black.
I don't know if I could do another lockdown of five months of poems.
Well, we certainly don't want another lockdown. We don't want to be encouraged into thinking that there might be another lockdown. But certainly anthologies like this, it is a joy to work your way through them, isn't it? And the value of them is that they lead you to other work, you know, if you read a certain poet, they can lead you to more work. And I think we're quite fortunate in Gaelic to date of the amount of anthologies that we do have. If you think back to, well, if you go right back, I suppose, to Sarah and the Bart Kefach and things like that.
Much further back.
Much further back, right, correct. You tell me, Jo, what's the first Gaelic anthology?
I think it's probably, and I'm sure there'll be some academic who will keep me right, but I think it's the Egg Collection.
The Egg Collection.
Which was Machmeister Alistair's son, Royal, wasn't it? And is that around, oh dear, 17?
I think it's usually dated to 1770.
I was going to say 1711, but I can't remember. I'm not very good on dates. I think that's certainly one of the earliest.
One is tempted to ask, why Egg? Had he been exiled there?
No, he was the Bailey of Canna, wasn't it? And Egg and Canna. So he was, that was his job, I suppose.
But we've been compiling anthologies for a number of centuries now, and this is the very latest. And I suppose, you know, like we've been alluding to, it's always going to be difficult. You're never going to please everybody with your selections. So you just have to kind of accept that, really, don't you? And hope that it will appeal to a huge number of people, which I know that this book will, for sure.
If I just could say something, I think if this book does anything valuable, it'll maybe introduce people to some things that they don't know about, but above all, that it might just raise the profile of poetry, that encourage more people to talk about poetry, to read poetry, to debate whether this poem should have been in and why was that one left out. I think that would all be very healthy.
I think also, if we take it in good faith, if you like, it is a selection. We're all going to pick on a particular poet and say, why didn't this poem appear? But we can find this poem in other sources. So just as a selection of wonderful poems by wonderful poets, it's a reason to celebrate.
I think we've got nowhere near enough anthologies. I think there should be dozens more, hundreds more. And partly this is just a conversation. This is part of a conversation and what types of poems do we have? But I think we badly need an anthology of contemporary poetry. I think we badly need an anthology of religious poetry in Gaelic. And then this should be an annual thing, maybe not for me and Jo, but I would love to see another anthology out for next Christmas where we can have a different conversation about some of the great wealth we have in Gaelic.
Well, let's hear another poem now, another song. Again, a song with which many of us are familiar. And Deborah, this is your choice of song from the collection. So it's Untitled Chapter. Would you like to tell us why you wanted to recite this one?
What number is it?
Oh, the number, let me find the number for you.
Number 51.
51. Sorry, I should have been keeping people informed about that through, so apologies for that. Number 51.
I always liked the poem, and recently I've been reading Mary Sheena Campbell's book about the poems by the author of this one, Ian MacKay. And he had quite a sad story. He went to North Carolina from Kintail, and he fought for King George whilst he was there, and he was imprisoned. This was actually after the Declaration of the Independence, but so it was quite a sad story. And also, this particular song may or may not have been written by him. There's a bit of doubt. I mean, Mary Sheena is quite clear that it was. But also, when looking at the book, what attracted to me this was the second verse in particular, where he talks about, he makes rather America look quite nice, but then you read the rest of the poem and he's basically wanting to get away. And all of the rest of his poems, I looked in vain for anything nice about America in them anywhere. So I was slightly on the wrong foot when by liking this one so much originally, but I still do really like it. So I'll read it in Gaelic here. Jean Catalan Savach, a Julian Morun, Jean Purich Marahao is tu andrasta naichur. Be oiker en akka in lan bertus is clue, is mavis tu narari is leer ferrigen new. Koran an America hashin andrasta, volhoer en a koile nach cherig gubrach. Nurigalavas an dubelach is ionas am las, be kroan be uvlan is be an shuker a fas. Is rovegor am heen, could den lua haun, then kotiken droga just at voor an kjaun, le en breekes en gore just het skulche gum baun, gonachir an tossen is a boken a haun. Hashinja naar inshin a kinsche galore, verhoeven an kruv gavi un a goin beo. Goin ali is bestje nag ewig an skach frog, govershin naar heken, naar neken von regshin ri jors. Mohori le falsche hintalen an bo, for an duur migresh marak, is min an fastjebek ook, piag fleskichen dana, an bona vrikjol, is nieneken duurlach, is an grui mar an ros. An toshek an over, bekriel ar sund, geeft je viergas an erich is braten a grund, big lunges an skaten, a chigen for huur, le heesker an tappe nach factje vol broek. Not quite the translation I had been more familiar with, but and in English, I read it in English.
Yes, please, Deborah.
Sleep peacefully, John MacKay. Sleep peacefully, my darling wee one. Stay as you are now in this new place. We'll have young men who are rich and famous. If you are worthy, you'll get one of them. This is America we're in now, in the shade of the unending forest. When winter goes and turns to warmth, nuts and apples and sugar will grow. I don't care much for the people here with their drucket coats and large hats with their short trousers split up to the belt. No one, more's the pity, wears stockings. We are sure enough Indians. None of us will survive in the gloomy trees. Wolves and wild beasts growl on each nook. We're in dire straits since deserting King George. My greeting and welcome to Kintail of the Cattle, where I was raised a while when a child. Dark-haired young men would dance to music, wavy-haired girls whose cheeks were like roses. At the beginning of autumn, our mood would be merry. We'd get deer from the forests, salmon from the river. The herring boats would come in under sail, scrapping fishermen you'd never see scowl. So that's it. And it is a song, and I have various versions of it. I quite like Billy Ross singing it with Ossian, but that's my choice.
Excellent choice. Thank you for that, Deborah. I've got another question here. I don't have a name, unfortunately, but Gorikisho Kishtvik, Ala Desert Island Discs for the two editors. Now, this is a recurring theme. We were also asked this on last Wednesday. Desert Island Discs, if banished to Staffa with just one poem only, which one would they choose? So this, I guess, is one poem from the book for Peter and for Joe.
Well, last time, why would you be banished to Staffa? It's a paradise if you were elevated to Staffa and got to spend the rest of your time there. Last time I chose, like an is, Uavanor as one of my choices. And also in the Alton McFeiffer Oster's Burnick Monroe, the galley of Clan Ranald, if only because it tells you how to skipper a boat, if only if it tells you how to get off the island and get through the storm.
But it's interesting that these are quite classic compositions. You're going for the classic rather than the contemporary.
Oh, probably.
Joe, them at the ends.
Well, again, Bilingual, because of the just the fabulous richness of language, quite apart from the practicalities of skippering or sailing. It's also a very long poem, so I would also want all of it so that I could study it. I think it's in something like 16 parts, and there's only one part of it in the book. So yeah, that would definitely be, I think, the one that I would take. But if Peter steals it from me and he gets off first, then I might take Natrach Vuan, simply because it's from Lewis. It's one I've grown up with. It has such a wonderful backstory to it, and it would always remind me of the western beaches, shores of Lewis, and indeed of Uist and Harris as well.
I suspect Natrach Vuan appeals to anyone who's grown up on an island with the surge of the sea. I know Murdo McFarlane, for instance, felt that when he was in Canada, he couldn't sleep well because he couldn't hear the sea. And partly it's one of the reasons why he returned to Lewis. Coyu, that's by the by. I know I've mentioned this before, Fadi, but I am going to mention it again. There is one of your poems in the book, and I know that you didn't choose it yourself, clearly. It was chosen by Joe and the rest of the panel. But I would like you to read it for us, please, if you have it to hand. Do you?
I do, but only if we get to hear Joe's other choice, because it's a much better poem. And so this is poem 35 from it, and this is Intinne. And it was translated by the late Northern Irish poet Kieran Carson, who I used to work with. Intinne. Nerva mi sa vunskol hwyr mi tinne slefin tanne, faran curin mach van skrif ter scotti yn paper. Hael cain ac yma'r unoch ach chydryf sa fa ysglych gyn anamyr yn ysgnifer yn y ddaim y machas, ma vrat yn a lian. Ir golfalaf machanan. Ysnaf gwsiri gydach I chaelch, nam llawn han tynnyr myrygych, sgachid ysglych gyn vristich science. The tin. When I was in primary school, I got myself this little flat tin where I'd stash my words writ on splinters of paper. What I remember is not the design, but how difficult it was to open without names and deeds leaping out like salmon from a net. The dumb babble of my languages, swimming forever towards their lost ground. The tin in my head rusting not to be opened without breaking its crust of salt.
I love the thought, Fadi, of all these words being rediscovered as you did recently, all these years later, when we know what you became, a wordsmith, a poet, a scholar.
Just tiny little tobacco boxes with these cut out words. It's like a memory, like an actual storehouse of memory that you discover again.
I'm conscious we're running out of time here, and honestly, I don't know if we're going to lose the link or not. So just in case we do, I think I'd better wind up. There was one other poem that Joe might have read, but I think we're perhaps out of time. But Ciad mi de tank and the heather acu, Patrick, Joe, Deborah, agus Anus, or something we call that I know, thank you so much for being with us. Deborah, Joe, Patrick, and Inez. Thank you also to Lower Press and to the Gaelic Books Council for organising an event, and to Joe Sanders hidden behind all this technology. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of you again for joining us tonight. We really do appreciate it. And who knows, we may be able to have more of these kind of discussions, certainly, and more forums for talking about poetry in the future. Just a reminder, that the book available in all good bookshops now, but given the state of play with shops and whatnot at the moment, probably best to buy online if you can from all the usual outlets. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll have to leave it there, I'm afraid, even though it's an abrupt goodbye. But from me in Glasgow, it's Eicheva, Ocean Live. Bye.